To make sure their GT40s are as authentic as possible, Superformance source all the components used originally by Ford. The company that made the original gauges still produces them nearly 50 years on. Based in the UK, they still use the original tooling to create their products. Of course, back in the late 1960s, all of the gauges were analog, and the dashboard of today's model remains true to this detail. Next, a technician carefully lays out the wiring on a setup called a harness board. Although initially confusing, the board has been designed so that the wiring scheme can be doubled back on itself to save space. If it wasn't, the board would have to be the length of the entire car. A view behind the dashboard reveals some of the same wiring features that you'd see if you took apart an original GT40. These include mechanical gauges that are plumbed into the engine. Brass fittings on the ends of some of the wires sit directly in the engine fluid compartments. Back in the fabrication area, the suspension assembly is being put together, starting with one of the rear control arms. The parts are clamped into a jig that was custom made for the job. Once everything is in place, it will be TIG welded together. Every element of this component is exactly the same as the original, right down to the dimension and thickness of the steel tubes. The control arm is a hinged suspension link between the chassis and the hub assembly. Unlike a wishbone, it has only one connecting point to the chassis, which means that the suspension system needs a separate link, or radius rod, to help control the movement of the wheel. The rear suspension is fully independent and includes trailing arms, unequal length lateral arms, coil springs, shock absorbers, and an anti-roll bar. The front suspension features unequal length wishbones with coil over shock absorbers. The GT40's two fuel tanks are fabricated by welding together pre-bent sections of stainless steel sheets. This is one of the few areas where Superformance GT40s differ from the original. Instead of stainless steel, the fuel tanks in the 1960s Ford GT40s were flexible bladders made of rubber. While such tanks are still available, they're extremely expensive. Stainless steel is less expensive, safer, and more durable. It can also be built and tested in-house. The finished tanks are tested by filling them with air, sealing their openings and immersing them in water. With no sign of rising bubbles, this tank is leak-free. The fuel tanks are now inserted into their compartments, which run under the doors on either side of the car. With the original car, the two tanks were linked by a 75mm pipe, which ran through the cockpit directly under the driver's legs. Back in the 1960s, racing drivers' safety was a shockingly low priority. This feature was clearly a safety hazard and completely unthinkable in a contemporary car. So Superformance has rerouted the link between the two tanks, and they're now joined in the engine compartment. As workers attach the first of the exterior body panels, the vehicle begins to take on its legendary form. Now the aluminium expansion tank goes in. Over 70% of the parts in the GT40s are interchangeable with the original. Custom built in-house, the expansion tank is one of those many parts. Next, the battery tray goes in. The battery is positioned here because there's no room in the engine bay for anything else. The oil cooler is then mounted on top of the battery tray and bolted into place. The rear sub-assembly is then bolted to the monocoque chassis. A set of hinge points allow the entire sub-assembly to raise up. Again, this design feature gives mechanics fast and easy access during races, where every second counts. The rear lower control arm is then bolted into place. The car suspension is critical in a car like this, especially with a chassis which at more than 5,400 kilograms per degree is one of the stiffest on the market. In the world of high-speed racing cars, the stiffer the chassis, the better the handling and performance. With the hinge system in place, the rear section of the car can be mounted into position. The brake cooling duct is then riveted into place. This will direct air from the front of the car over the brake discs for improved efficiency. The brakes use 4-piston calipers. The aluminium closure panels then go on. These increase the strength and aerodynamic efficiency of the car. The factory in South Africa ships the GT40s with everything but the engine and transmission. Customers can choose which powertrain to add when the car arrives. The original GT40 had a dry sump oil tank, which is no longer necessary. So today, the car's air conditioning system is concealed inside a replica of the tank. Once the powertrain has been installed, technicians will put the vehicle through a rigorous dyno test to ensure it meets all the stringent parameters of the original GT40 design. In fact, modern GT40s outperform their predecessor. While the engines they install are modern versions of those from the 1960s, they're much more powerful. The firm recommends Ford racing engines or Shelby engines, but customers can choose from any Ford-based small or big block V8. With the amazing GT40, Henry Ford finally got his revenge on Enzo Ferrari and put an end to the legendary Italian carmaker's 6-year winning streak at Le Mans. In 1966, after 3 years of trial and error, Ford became the first American manufacturer to ever win the race. The beautiful speed machine went on to dominate the world of long-distance sports car racing for years. No wonder so many car aficionados still dream of owning this piece of racing history.